Imagine for a moment that you are, lying on an operating table. The monitor's flatline. Your brain activity completely ceases. For all medical intents and purposes, you have crossed the threshold. You are dead. Then, by some absolute miracle of modern resuscitation, you are brought back. You open your eyes. And instead of just telling your loved ones a vague, disjointed story about seeing a bright light, you immediately ask for a pen.
Right, which is not exactly the standard post-resuscitation reaction. I mean, people are usually just confused.
Exactly. But you sit down and you draw a perfectly detailed, structurally complex map of the universe.
And, it sounds like the plot of a science fiction novel, but it is a very real, well-documented event.
Yeah, that is exactly what happened to a man named Ysef Shakur. Following a profound near-death experience, he didn't rely on the clunky, frankly inadequate tools of human language to explain where he went, because words just constantly fail us when we try to describe the indescribable. Instead, Shakur drafted a literal cosmic map. He physically charted the unchartable, and his hand-drawn image recently went incredibly viral.
Yeah, and when you look at it, you immediately understand why it captured the public's imagination so fiercely. It's a stunning visual representation of a concept that humanity has basically been struggling to articulate for thousands of years.
I really want to paint a vivid picture of this drawing for you listening right now, because it is staggering. At the very bottom of the page, acting as this sort of anchor point, is Earth. But from there, Shakur didn't just draw a simple tunnel leading to some fluffy clouds. He mapped out a deeply layered architectural structure of reality. You see this glowing spiral pathway weaving upward through distinct levels of existence. And the detail that really gives you pause are these incredibly thin, delicate lines. He called them strands. These strands physically connect the human beings walking around on Earth directly into these higher dimensional realms.
They look almost like energetic umbilicals, right? Tying us to the sky.
Yes. Energetic umbilicals is the perfect way to put it. And at the very top of this entire cosmic architecture, the apex of the drawing, he sketched a massive encompassing sphere. He labeled it simply the Oversoul.
And that specific label is fascinating because it immediately implies a collective source. It's not a separate, distant deity sitting on a throne judging people. It's a central hub of consciousness that every single living being is intimately tethered to.
And he summarized the entire drawing with one profound message that he brought back from the other side. Everything is connected. That concept right there is the compass for what we are investigating in today's deep dive. We're taking Shakur's viral map, and we're going to cross-reference his vision of transcendence with an absolute mountain of data. We're talking decades of clinical near-death experience research, the mind-bending theories of quantum cosmology, ancient mystical traditions, and the absolute furthest frontiers of human consciousness studies. We really want to see what actually happens at the very edge of human existence.
It's an ambitious undertaking, certainly. But what makes this exploration so compelling is that we aren't just, comparing religious texts or philosophy. We are looking at peer-reviewed medical data, physiological models, and quantum mechanics, and finding that they are all pointing toward the exact same startling conclusion about the fundamental nature of reality.
So let's unpack this, because whether you are a hard-nosed materialist who firmly believes that human consciousness is nothing more than chemical reactions in wet brain tissue, or whether you consider yourself deeply, intuitively spiritual, the source material we are about to explore challenges the very bedrock of how we perceive time, space, and the human mind. Let's start at the beginning, with the blueprint itself. Let's define the vehicle that took Shakur to that cosmic architecture. What exactly constitutes a near-death experience or an NDE?
Well, to really understand the modern scientific framework of the NDE, we actually need to look backward into antiquity. There's this very common misconception that near-death experiences are a thoroughly modern phenomenon, a byproduct of defibrillators and advanced CPR techniques in modern hospitals. But the historical record blows that assumption entirely out of the water.
Because people have been having these experiences long before electricity was even discovered, right?
Thousands of years before. For instance, we have to look at the work of the ancient Greek philosopher Plato. Roughly 2,400 years ago, in his foundational text, The Republic, Plato recounts the myth of Ur was a soldier who was ostensibly killed in battle. His body was recovered days later, and as he was laid out on the funeral pyre, literally about to be burned, he suddenly revived.
I can only imagine the absolute panic of the people standing around that pyre.
Oh, it must have been pure chaos. But when woke up, he didn't just ask for a drink of water. He began to describe a profoundly detailed journey. He described his soul separating from his physical body. He talked about traveling with a multitude of other souls to a mysterious intermediary place where they underwent a life review and were judged. And most strikingly, he described seeing a magnificent straight pillar of light extending all the way through heaven and earth, basically holding the universe together.
So the core vocabulary of the NDE, the out-of-body sensation, the life review, the all-encompassing pillar of light, this isn't some new age internet trend. This has literally been baked into human history for millennia.
It has always been with us. But the medical community largely ignored or dismissed it as folklore until the mid-1970s. That was when a psychiatrist named Dr. Raymond Moody really forced the scientific establishment to pay attention. In 1975, Moody published a book called Life After Life, where he coined the actual term near-death experience. He had meticulously interviewed around 150 patients who had survived severe medical crises, and he noticed that they were all telling variations of the exact same story.
Regardless of their background or their religion or their age, right?
Correct. Moody identified 15 distinct recurring elements. He noted that people almost always began by describing a profound sense of ineffability.
Meaning that the English language or any human language just doesn't have the words to capture the bandwidth of what they felt.
Yes, exactly. They would say things like, it's like trying to describe a color that doesn't exist on Earth. Then they would report a sudden, overwhelming sense of peace and a complete cessation of all physical pain, even if their body had just been crushed in a horrific car accident. They frequently reported hearing a strained buzzing or ringing noise, followed by the sensation of being pulled rapidly through a dark tunnel or void.
The classic tunnel of light that everyone talks about.
Exactly. And following the tunnel, they would find themselves entirely outside of their physical bodies, often floating near the ceiling of the hospital room, just calmly watching the doctors work on them. As the experience progressed, they reported meeting deceased loved ones, encountering a radiant being of light, undergoing a panoramic review of their entire life, and eventually arriving at a boundary, a point of no return.
And crossing that boundary means biological, irreversible death.
Right. So they are told, or they instinctively realize, they must go back. Now, Moody's foundational work was later refined by other researchers, most notably Kenneth Ring, who basically distilled those 15 elements into a very clean 5-stage clinical model.
Walk us through Kenneth Ring's 5 stages, because I find it fascinating that a supposed hallucination can be categorized into such a predictable clinical sequence.
It is highly structured. Stage 1 is the onset of deep peace and well-being. Stage 2 is the separation of consciousness from the physical body. Stage 3 is entering a transitional darkness or a void, so this is the tunnel phase. Stage 4 is the emergence into an impossibly bright yet deeply comforting light. And the final stage, stage 5, is fully entering and interacting with another realm of existence through that light.
Okay, so we have this structured sequence. But a skeptic might listen to this and think, all right, sure, maybe a few dozen people had a weird reaction to morphine in the 70s. How common is this really? Are we talking about a fringe statistical anomaly, or is this happening every day?
This is where the clinical data becomes truly undeniable. The turning point for the medical community was the year 2001. A highly respected Dutch cardiologist named Dr. Pim van Lommel decided to subject the NDE phenomenon to rigorous, modern scientific scrutiny. He conducted a massive prospective study, meaning he didn't just interview people years after the fact where memories get distorted. He tracked patients in real time as they came into the hospital.
Which totally eliminates the problem of memories becoming romanticized over decades.
Precisely. And he published his findings in The Lancet, which is, one of the oldest, most prestigious and rigorously peer-reviewed medical journals in the entire world. Van Lommel studied 344 consecutive patients who had suffered cardiac arrest. These were people who were clinically dead, no heartbeat, no respiration, a totally flatline EEG. And he found that a staggering 18% of these survivors reported a classic, highly structured near-death experience.
18%. I mean, think about how many people have heart attacks or cardiac events globally every single day. If almost 1 in 5 of the people who flatline are experiencing this, the numbers are astronomical.
They are. Because modern resuscitation technology, defibrillators, advanced pharmacology, ECMO machines, they have become so incredibly effective, we are bringing far more people back from the absolute brink of permanent death than at any other time in human history. Current demographic estimates suggest that roughly 9 million people in the United States alone have had a near-death experience.
9 million Americans. That is the population of New York City, all walking around with a memory of leaving their bodies and traveling to another dimension. But with a sample size that massive, how do researchers separate the wheat from the chaff? If someone comes into the ER, gets pumped full of anesthetics, and has a wild, chaotic dream about, like, a flying purple elephant, how does a doctor know that's not a genuine transcendent event?
And that is the critical challenge of consciousness research, and it's exactly why Dr. Bruce Grayson, a pioneer in the field, developed what is known as the 16-point NDE scale. It basically acts as a standardized metric to filter out hallucinations, drug trips, and dreams, focusing only on the authentic phenomenon.
How does the Grayson scale actually work in practice? Like, if I'm a patient waking up, what are you asking me?
So it breaks the experience down into 4 distinct domains: cognitive, affective, paranormal, and transcendental. And it asks very specific, graded questions within those domains.
Give me an example of the cognitive questions.
In the cognitive domain, the questionnaire asks things like, did time seem to speed up or slow down? Or did you suddenly seem to understand everything about the universe? In the affective domain, it asks about the intensity of peace or joy. In the paranormal domain, it asks if the patient experienced sudden telepathy or if their vision and hearing were suddenly more vivid than normal earthly perception. And in the transcendental domain, it asks if they encountered a mystical being or reached a border of no return.
And how is it scored? Like, what's the passing grade for an NDE?
Each of the 16 questions is scored from 0 to 2. Out of a maximum possible score of 32, a patient must score a 7 or higher for the event to be formally classified as a true clinical NDE for research purposes.
So it's an incredibly stringent filter. They really want to weed out the background noise.
It is, and the scientific rigor surrounding this has only tightened. Just recently, in 2022, a massive multidisciplinary consensus statement was published, bringing together intensive care doctors, neurologists, and psychiatrists to establish new medical guidelines. They even updated the terminology. They now formally refer to this phenomenon as Red A recalled experience of death.
Or AD. Okay, I actually really like that. It sounds much more precise and medical. So how does a rectal experience of death physiologically or psychologically differ from, say, ICU delirium? Because as I'm playing the skeptic, I'm going to argue that an oxygen-starved brain floating in a soup of trauma hormones is obviously going to misfire and create crazy images.
The skeptic's argument sounds perfectly logical on the surface, but it completely falls apart when you analyze the actual phenomenology of the experiences. What separates a true ED from ICU delirium, vivid dreaming, or psychedelic drug trips like high doses of ketamine or DMT is the absolute lack of chaotic or absurd imagery.
What do you mean by absurd imagery?
Well, think about a typical dream or a hallucination. You might dream that you are walking through your childhood home, but suddenly the walls are made of marshmallows, and your third-grade math teacher is a giant talking clock giving you a pop quiz on geography. The imagery is highly fragmented, deeply self-centered, and utterly devoid of logical cohesion. In drug-induced states, people often report seeing bizarre geometric forms, machine elves, or terrifying neon distortions of their own bodies.
Right. It's a funhouse mirror reflection of your subconscious. It makes no linear sense.
Exactly. But a true recalled experience of death lacks all of that absurdity. NDers do not report seeing giant clocks or melting walls. Instead, they universally report a state of hyperlucidity. They describe an unexpected, crystal-clear mental focus. Even though their physical brain is clinically offline, showing zero electrical activity on the monitors, their core sense of self, their identity, persists completely intact.
They know exactly who they are. They aren't confused.
Yes. And the narrative arc of what they experience is logical, coherent, and profoundly meaningful. They don't report the chaos of a dying brain. They report an experience of absolute order and a reality that feels, in their own words, more real than real.
That is a staggering distinction. But I do have to push back here because we are painting a very rosy, peaceful, serene picture of this transition. As I was going through the research materials, I noticed a statistic that genuinely gave me pause. It seems that roughly 15% of NDE cases are categorized as hellish or deeply distressing. What is happening to the 15% of people who don't get greeted by warm light and loving relatives?
It is a vital and sobering aspect of the research, and you are totally right to bring it up. The literature confirms that not everyone immediately lands in a beautiful sunlit meadow. The distressing or hellish experiences are very, very real to the people who go through them.
What do these distressing experiences actually look like? Are we talking about traditional fire and brimstone?
Rarely fire and brimstone in the medieval Dante sense. Distressing NDEs typically fall into a few distinct categories. Some people describe being trapped in an infinite, featureless void, a dark, suffocating emptiness where they are entirely alone with their thoughts for what feels like eternity. Others describe wandering through barren, desolate, gray wastelands, surrounded by other shadowy figures who seem confused, angry, or trapped in repetitive, meaningless actions.
That sounds psychologically terrifying, like a sensory deprivation tank of pure despair.
It is characterized by overwhelming feelings of terror, intense isolation, and a profound sense of abandonment. They feel entirely cut off from the light, from the source, from any sense of love.
Why does that happen? Is it a judgment? Are they being punished for their earthly lives?
Researchers who specialize in distressing NDEs have observed a fascinating pattern that challenges the idea of external judgment or punishment. They note that these hellish landscapes are almost always temporary. The individual usually escapes the distressing state, and the method of escape is incredibly revealing.
How do they get out? Do they just wake up?
They get out by utilizing conscious intent. Often the person simply breaks down and cries out for help, or they manage to mentally focus their intention on the pure concept of love or on a divine figure they trust. And the moment they do that, the very instant they shift their internal frequency from fear and isolation to a request for connection, the environment instantly responds.
The environment reacts to their thoughts.
Precisely. The void shatters, or a brilliant light pierces the gray wasteland, and they're pulled upward into the peace of the classic NDE. What this suggests is incredibly profound. It implies that this realm is a participatory reality. It is highly responsive to the state of your consciousness. If an individual crosses over while entirely consumed by bitterness, anger, or a deep belief in their own isolation, the environment simply reflects that state back to them.
It's like a cosmic mirror.
Exactly. It's not a fixed objective hell constructed by a punitive deity. It is a psychological manifestation. And as soon as they ask for help, as soon as they open themselves up to love, the environment immediately shifts to accommodate that new state of mind.
Wow, okay, that entirely reframes the concept of the afterlife. So if the NDE itself, the tunnel, the out-of-body state, the void is just the vehicle of transition, where exactly is this vehicle traveling to? This brings us back to Ysef Shakur's drawing. Let's look closer at his specific cosmic map and see how his visual representation aligns with these global accounts of what we might call afterlife geographies.
Well, when you lay Shakur's drawings side by side with cross-cultural NDE reports, the architectural parallels are just stunning. Let's revisit those strands he drew, the delicate glowing lines connecting humans on Earth to the higher realms and the Oversoul.
Yeah, that visual really stuck with me. It looks like we are all individually plugged into the sky like marionettes with energetic strings.
And that specific visual is not unique to Shakur. It has a direct, historically documented parallel in esoteric and occult traditions, specifically within 19th century theosophy.
What does theosophy say about it?
Theosophical texts describe a concept known as the silver cord. They argue that a human being isn't just a physical body, but possesses an astral or energetic body as well. The silver cord is described as a literal, energetic lifeline, an elastic, luminous tether that links the dense physical body to the immortal soul.
So it's a cosmic umbilical cord?
Precisely. During sleep or during a spontaneous out-of-body experience, the consciousness can travel, but it is always anchored to the physical form by this silver cord. The esoteric tradition states that the moment of true, irreversible physical death occurs only when that silver cord is finally severed. Shakur's strands are a perfect, modern, visual representation of this exact ancient concept.
That is wild. Okay, what about the border of no return that you mentioned earlier as part of Dr. Grayson's scale? In Shakur's drawing, he depicted a sort of spiral vortex separating the Earth level from the higher Oversoul. How do other cultures describe that ultimate boundary? Because I assume not everyone sees a spiral.
This is where we encounter the brilliant intersection of universal human experience and localized cultural vocabulary. The encounter with a boundary is universally reported across the globe, but the way that boundary actually looks to the experiencer changes dramatically based on their earthly background and their cultural conditioning.
So the brain dresses up the raw data in clothes it recognizes.
Exactly. In modern Western clinical settings, patients often describe the boundary in very structural, man-made terms. They might say they came to a beautiful wooden fence in a meadow, or a heavy ornate door, or simply a line drawn in the dirt that they knew they absolutely couldn't cross.
Right, because fences and doors are how we delineate boundaries in Western society.
But if you examine NDE reports from indigenous Congo traditions in Central Africa, they almost never see fences. They describe walking through a lush forest and arriving at the bank of the mighty Zaire River.
Because in their daily geographical reality, the river is the ultimate dividing line.
Yes, exactly. And if we look at reports from Iranian Islamic culture, the imagery shifts again. Experiencers there frequently describe crossing vast, shimmering oceans of light or standing before massive, impenetrable, glowing walls.
Okay, let me try an analogy here to see if I'm grasping the mechanics of this. It sounds like we are all logging into a localized server of a massive global internet. When an Iranian experiencer logs in, their cultural software renders the user interface as an ocean of light. When a Westerner logs in, their software renders the interface as a tunnel or a wooden fence. A Congo experiencer's software renders a river. But regardless of the specific graphic interface they are looking at on their screen, they are all accessing the exact same underlying cosmic mainframe.
That is an incredibly accurate analogy. The cultural vocabulary and the visual metaphors they use to describe the environment is deeply malleable. But the ontology, the fundamental nature and purpose of the reality they are interacting with, remains entirely invariant and consistent across every culture on the globe.
And what is that invariant nature? When they look past the river or the fence or the ocean of light, who or what is waiting for them on the other side?
Universally, experiencers report encountering what we can only describe as a supreme intelligence. But what is truly paradigm shifting about these reports is how this intelligence behaves. It is almost never described in the dogmatic, punitive, judgmental terms that many organized earthly religions use.
So they aren't seeing an angry deity sitting on a golden throne holding a giant ledger of all their sins.
Very, very rarely. God is almost never described as an anthropomorphic person. Instead, experiencers describe stepping into an all-encompassing environment that is composed entirely of three things: love, light, and unity. They encounter a being of light that doesn't just emit physical brightness, but radiates an overwhelming aura of absolute, unconditional acceptance and total awareness.
Light that literally knows you.
Intimately. And the way this being communicates is fascinating. There are no booming voices from the clouds. Communication happens via instantaneous telepathy, or what experiencers often refer to as direct knowing.
Direct knowing. How does that feel compared to normal conversation? Like, how is it different?
Imagine someone wanting to explain the concept of quantum mechanics to you. In the physical world, they would have to speak words. You would have to process the sound waves, translate the vocabulary, and slowly build an understanding over hours. With direct knowing, an immensely complex concept, along with all its emotional nuance, is simply downloaded into your consciousness in a microsecond. You don't just hear the information, you instantly become the knowing of it.
Okay, here is where it gets absolutely mind-bending. Speaking of cosmic mainframes and downloading data in a microsecond, what happens when you access your own personal file in this system? Let's talk about what is arguably the most staggering transformative feature of the entire NDE phenomenon: the life review.
The life review. It is the emotional and moral crucible of the near-death state. It is the element that permanently alters the psychological trajectory of the people who survive it.
Let's break down exactly what this is, because we need to dispel the cliché. When people hear your life flashes before your eyes, they picture a fast-forward movie montage. A few quick highlights of your wedding, your first car, your graduation. But according to the clinical data, the phenomenology of the life review is nothing like a highlight reel. It is described as a panoramic, 3D, instantaneous reliving of one's entire life. Literally every single second, from the first breath you took as a screaming newborn, right up to the exact moment of the car crash or the cardiac arrest.
And the crucial distinction there is the word reliving. It is not passive observation. You aren't sitting in a cosmic movie theater eating popcorn while watching yourself on a screen. The experiencer undergoes a deeply profound phenomenon called affective awareness.
Affective awareness, I want to spend some time on this. What does that actually mean in practice?
It means that you do not just see the actions you took. You are forced to feel the exact emotional impact of your actions on the people around you.
Wait, so I feel what they felt.
Yes. If you were cruel to someone, say you bullied a kid in middle school, or you unfairly yelled at a waiter because you were having a bad day, you do not experience that memory from your own defensive, justified point of view. You are shifted into their consciousness. You feel the sharp sting of humiliation, the fear, the sadness that your words caused in their heart, exactly as they experienced it.
Oh, wow. That's terrifying.
And conversely, it applies to the good you've done. If you performed a quiet act of kindness, giving a stranger a compliment, or comforting a friend, you feel the exact warmth, relief, and gratitude that bloomed in their chest because of your action. You experience the ripple effect of your existence through the nervous systems of everyone you ever touched.
That is incredibly heavy. I'm trying to wrap my head around that. It's like, imagine playing a massive, incredibly complex virtual reality role-playing game for 80 years. And at the end of the game, you die, the headset comes off, and you don't just get a high score on a leaderboard. Instead, the game forces you to replay every single interaction you ever had. But this time, your controller is taken away, and you are locked into the first-person perspective of every single NPC, the non-player characters that you helped, hurt, ignored, or loved. You have to endure every emotion you caused them to feel.
That is a phenomenal way to conceptualize it. It is the ultimate exercise in forced empathy. And what is vital to understand is the context in which this happens. You experience all of this pain and joy from an objective, entirely non-judgmental perspective.
So the being of light isn't standing there shaking its head at you going, how could you do that?
Not at all. The being of light provides an environment of absolute unconditional love and total truth. The light isn't judging you. The light is simply holding the mirror up so that you must judge yourself. You become your own harshest critic and your own ultimate forgiver.
But mechanistically, scientifically, how is this possible? Where is all this data being stored? Because if my physical brain is currently flatlining on a hospital bed, starved of oxygen, where is the cosmic hard drive that holds a panoramic, 3D, emotional, multisensory record of every fraction of a second of my life, plus the internal emotional states of everyone I ever spoke to?
That specific question really bridges the gap between theoretical physics and ancient mysticism. In the esoteric traditions we mentioned earlier, like Theosophy, this universal hard drive is referred to as the Akashic Records. In the Congo traditions, it is often called the Book of Life. It is the ancient belief in an indestructible cosmic memory bank that records the entire history of the universe.
Right, but that's mysticism. It's a beautiful poetic idea. But how does modern science or physics approach the concept of a cosmic memory bank?
Interestingly, modern physics is beginning to provide a mathematical framework for this exact concept. We can look directly at the work of systems theorist and philosopher Dr. Ervin Laszlo. He theorized the existence of what he calls the A field, or the Akashic field. Laszlo proposes that this is a tangible, subquantum field existing within the cosmic vacuum, the very fabric of space itself.
Wait, I thought the vacuum of space was, by definition, completely empty.
That is classical Newtonian thinking. Quantum field theory tells us the vacuum is actually boiling with energy and potential. Laszlo argues it is a plenum, a completely full space that holds a holographic record of all events, all wave patterns, all interactions that have ever occurred in the history of the universe.
You said holographic. Why is that specific word important here?
Because of how holographic memory works. If you have a standard photograph and you cut it in half, you lose half the image. But if you have a piece of holographic film and you cut it in half, each half still contains the entire image, just at a lower resolution. In a holographic universe, the information of the whole is permanently encoded in every single part.
So every cubic centimeter of empty space contains the data of my entire life.
Theoretically, yes. And if we look back even further to the 18th century, the brilliant mathematician Pierre-Simon Laplace proposed a famous thought experiment that aligns with this perfectly. It is known as Laplace's demon.
I've heard of Laplace's demon. Explain how it relates to this.
Laplace imagined a theoretical superintelligence, a demon or intellect that possessed the precise location and momentum of every single atom in the entire universe at any given moment, and understood all the forces acting upon them. For an intellect vast enough to process that data, Laplace argued, nothing would be uncertain. The future, just like the past, would be entirely present and visible before its eyes.
Because it knows all the variables. And that sounds exactly like the total instantaneous 360-degree knowledge imparted by the being of light during the life review. The light is acting as Laplace's demon. It is accessing Laszlo's A field, reading the holographic record of the universe, and downloading it directly into the experiencer's consciousness.
Precisely. And the implications of that are staggering. It suggests that our lives, our choices, and our secret emotional states are not fleeting, ephemeral events that just disappear into the past. They are permanently etched into the informational fabric of the cosmos.
Okay, I have to take a breath, because it is very easy to get completely swept up in the majesty and the poetry of an empathic, universal, holographic database. But I want to play devil's advocate here. We have to address the elephant in the room. What does traditional medical science, strict materialist biology say is physically happening in the wet meat of the brain to cause all of these incredible visions?
Traditional medical science has dedicated a lot of resources to proposing physiological and psychological models that can explain NDEs without ever resorting to the supernatural or the quantum.
Let's hear the best materialist arguments. Give me the top theories.
The most frequently cited is the cerebral hypoxia model. This is the simple idea that the brain is rapidly starving of oxygen. As oxygen levels drop, the visual cortex in the back of the brain begins to shut down from the periphery inward, which perfectly recreates the visual sensation of moving through a dark tunnel toward a central point of light. The lack of oxygen also causes severe hallucinations and cognitive breakdown.
Okay, lack of oxygen equals tunnel vision and crazy visions. That makes physiological sense. What else?
There is the endorphin release theory. When the physical body recognizes it is undergoing massive catastrophic trauma, the brain attempts to protect itself by triggering a massive flood of endorphins and endogenous painkillers. This massive chemical dump accounts for the profound feelings of overwhelming peace, bliss, and the sudden cessation of pain that experiencers report.
So the piece is just a chemical band-aid.
Correct. There's also the temporal lobe seizure model. Neurologists have noted that abnormal electrical activity, basically microseizures in the brain's right temporal lobe, can artificially produce intense out-of-body sensations, memory flashbacks, which could explain the life review, and feelings of deep religious awe.
What about psychological theories? Is there a defense mechanism angle to this?
Yes, the expectancy model. This is a purely psychological theory suggesting that when the ego realizes it is facing imminent, terrifying annihilation, it subconsciously constructs a comforting, wish fulfillment fantasy. It draws on the person's cultural and religious expectations to soothe itself against the absolute terror of death.
I also read about something called the birth model. How does that fit in?
The birth model was popular for a while. It suggested that moving down a dark tunnel toward a bright light is actually a psychological regression to our very first trauma, the memory of being born. The idea is that we are remembering moving down the dark birth canal into the bright, cold lights of the delivery room, surrounded by figures waiting to receive us.
Okay, but does that actually hold up to scrutiny? Do humans really have the capacity to remember their own birth?
It doesn't hold up well at all, primarily due to neurobiology. Newborn infants simply lack the visual acuity, the spatial stability, and the cortical coding capacity in their undeveloped brains to register or store complex visual memories of the birth experience. Furthermore, researchers have studied individuals who were born via cesarean section people who literally never traveled down a birth canal.
And what did they find with the C-section babies?
The C-section babies report the exact same classic tunnel imagery during their NDEs as those born via natural delivery. So the birth model is largely considered a bust in the scientific community.
Okay, so the birth model fails. But what about a more sophisticated modern brain model? I know there is one based on archetypes that tries to explain the entire sequence.
You are likely thinking of the model proposed by Dr. Andrew Newberg and Dr. Eugene Dechili. It is a highly complex, robust neurophysiological model based on what they call brain archetypes.
Break that down for me. How does it work?
They suggest that the extreme, catastrophic stress of dying triggers an ergotropic activation in the brain. The ergotropic system is responsible for our fight-or-flight response. The amygdala goes into massive overdrive, releasing stress hormones. This peaks and activates what they call the dissolution archetype.
And what does that do?
It causes a breakdown of reality, producing terrifying, fragmented, or hellish visions. This perfectly accounts for the 15% of distressing NDEs we discussed earlier.
Ah, okay. So the hellish NDE is just the brain in maximum panic mode.
Precisely. But then, as the physiological stress reaches an absolute breaking point, a safety switch flips. The brain triggers a massive trophotropic breakthrough. The trophotropic system is the body's rest and digest calming system. This profound, calming response suddenly and violently overrides the fear, activating the transcendent integration archetype.
And that causes the good stuff, the peace and the light.
Yes. They argue this biological pivot produces the feelings of absolute divine peace, the sense of cosmic unity, and the classic out-of-body experience.
I have to admit, that sounds like an incredibly solid, tight, biological explanation. Stress peaks, the brain flips a master safety switch to prevent a total meltdown, and you hallucinate peace and unity to ease your passing. It's elegant. So why do materialist models struggle? Why is this still a debate? Why isn't the case closed?
Materialist models are elegant, but they struggle deeply, and frankly, they fail when confronted with one undeniable, heavily documented aspect of NDE research: veridical perception.
Veridical perception. Let's really unpack that term, because this is where the materialist paradigm hits a brick wall. What exactly is veridical perception?
Veridical simply means truthful or coinciding with reality. Veridical perception refers to documented cases where a patient is clinically dead. Their heart is stopped, their eyes are taped shut with surgical tape, their brainwaves are entirely flatlined. Yet during their out-of-body experience, floating above the table, they observe highly specific, unpredictable details in the operating room that are later independently verified by the medical staff.
Give me an example. What kind of details? Are they just, guessing that a doctor was holding a scalpel?
Much more specific than that. There are famous cases, like the Pam Reynolds case, where patients have accurately described the exact, highly unusual custom resuscitation equipment being used on them, tools they had never seen before in their lives. They recount the specific, sometimes inappropriate conversations the surgeons had while they were dead. They describe hidden objects in the room, like a nurse's brightly colored shoelaces, or a serial number on top of a machine that they couldn't possibly have seen from the operating table, even if their eyes were wide open.
That is impossible under the hypoxia model. You can't hallucinate a serial number.
Exactly. But it gets even more inexplicable. The most astonishing data points come from cases involving patients who have been totally blind since birth.
Wait, people born without the biological capacity for sight.
Yes. People whose optic nerves have never functioned, who have never experienced visual sight in their entire earthly lives, report seeing the operating room during their NDE. They accurately describe the colors of the doctor's scrubs, the shape of the lighting fixtures, and the layout of the room with perfect visual clarity. And then, upon resuscitation and returning to their bodies, they instantly return to total blindness.
Okay, Stop right there. If a person who is blind from birth is accurately describing the visual color of a surgical tool while their brain is flatlining, the oxygen deprivation model completely falls apart. You cannot biologically hallucinate a visual reality that your brain has never ever possessed the neural architecture to see in the first place.
It is the ultimate anomaly, and because of these cases, researchers are forced to consider an entirely different paradigm. We have to look at what is called the receiver model, or sometimes the filter model of consciousness.
This is the idea that the brain doesn't actually make the mind.
Exactly. What if consciousness is a fundamental, irreducible property of the universe, much like electromagnetism or gravity? In this model, the physical biological brain does not generate your consciousness. Rather, it acts as an antenna. It is a biological receiver tuning into this universal field of consciousness.
So what is the brain's actual job then, if it's not making consciousness?
Its job is to filter. The philosopher Aldous Huxley famously called the brain a reducer valve. Normally, the brain acts as a damping filter, shutting out the vast, overwhelming, multidimensional cosmic reality so that we can focus on simple, earthly, evolutionary survival.
Right. If you are constantly intimately aware of the infinite cosmic matrix and feeling the emotional state of every living creature on Earth, you're probably going to forget to eat, or you're going to get eaten by a tiger or hit by a bus while crossing the street.
Precisely. We need the biological blinders to function in the 3D world. But during a severe cardiac arrest, when the biological hardware begins to fail and shut down, that damping filter breaks. The reducing valve opens. The biological blinders are forcibly removed. And suddenly, the consciousness is no longer restricted to the tight biological limits of the skull. It expands back into its natural state and perceives the full, unfiltered panoramic spectrum of reality.
This is a massive paradigm shift. But I know skeptics hate this theory. Let me give you the classic analogy that skeptics used. I want you to dismantle it. A skeptic will say, if you have a physical radio sitting on a table and it is playing beautiful music, and I take a hammer and I smash that radio into 100 pieces, the music immediately stops. Doesn't that prove definitively that the physical radio was generating the music? Therefore, when the brain dies, the consciousness stops. It's proof.
That is the cornerstone of the materialist argument. But the logical flaw in that analogy is profound. Taking a hammer and smashing the radio does not prove the radio created the music. It only proves that the localized receiver is broken. The radio waves, the actual signal, the symphony, are still broadcasting perfectly in the air all around you. You just lack the physical hardware to tune into that specific frequency in that specific room anymore.
Whoa, that completely flips the script. The music never stopped. You just broke the speaker.
Exactly. The brain is the speaker. Consciousness is the broadcast.
So if consciousness is the signal, and the fragile human brain is just a biological antenna tuning into a specific earthly frequency, it leaves us with a massive problem. Where is the broadcast actually coming from? To answer that, we have to look away from biology entirely and look upward at quantum physics and the cosmos. Let's delve into quantum cosmology and the multiverse. How does modern physics map onto these NDE reports of boundless light and infinite connection?
Well, let's start with the very origin of our universe, the Big Bang. In popular culture, we are heavily conditioned to think of the Big Bang as a giant explosion into empty space. We picture a firework going off in a dark, pre-existing sky, throwing shrapnel outward. But cosmologists and theoretical physicists tell us that mental model is fundamentally incorrect.
How so? What actually happened?
The Big Bang was not an explosion in space. It was the unfolding and expansion of space-time itself. There was no outside space for it to explode into. Every single galaxy, every star, every planet, and every atom in your body right now was originally compressed into a single, infinitely dense singularity. Everything that exists unfolded from that exact same point.
So space didn't even exist before the Big Bang.
Correct. And this scientific model aligns perfectly with the seemingly paradoxical, mystical sensation reported in deep NDEs. Experiencers constantly state that everything is connected and that during their transcendent journey, they felt they couldn't go anywhere but into themselves.
Because there is no out there.
Exactly. If the entire universe unfolded from a single singularity, then fundamentally, at the deepest quantum level, everything is still connected. We are all entangled fragments of that original point.
Which brings us to a highly controversial but utterly fascinating theory proposed by Dr. Robert Lanza. It's called biocentrism. This theory argues that biology and human consciousness are not just random accidents of a dead universe, but are actually the foundational driving forces of reality.
Yes. Lanza, drawing on quantum mechanics, argues that space and time are not hard, physical, external objects. They are simply mental constructs. They are the software tools that animal consciousness uses to interpret, organize, and navigate a fundamentally non-local, timeless reality.
Space and time are just software.
That is the premise. And if space and time are merely the operating system of the physical brain, then bodily death doesn't mean the end of consciousness. It just means the consciousness uninstalls that software and transitions to another framework or potentially another universe within the many worlds interpretation of quantum physics.
Okay, this is incredibly dense physics. Let's use an analogy from the source material to ground this, because the black hole metaphor really helped me visualize what Lanza is talking about. Think of a massive dying star in deep space. When that star runs out of nuclear fuel, it collapses in on itself due to gravity, and it forms a black hole. Now, from the perspective of an outside observer, an astronomer looking through a telescope, the star seems to shift from emitting bright visible light to becoming an invisible dark void. It disappears from our visual frequency.
It looks like it has ceased to exist. But from the perspective of the matter and energy inside the collapsing star, it hasn't disappeared at all. It has merely transitioned into a state of infinite density.
Exactly. The metaphor is that a dying human being is just like that collapsing star. We are transitioning from a finite frequency of physical perception, the visible light and sound we emit and absorb while alive, into an infinite frequency of perception. So, to a doctor standing over a flatlining body in the ICU, the patient looks like they have entered a dark, empty void. They have flatlined. But to the freed consciousness of the patient themselves, that transition is perceived as stepping into infinite brightness, total calmness, and absolute unfettered reality.
It's a brilliant way to frame it. And what's fascinating here is how this transitions into the concept of the multiverse. Cosmological models increasingly suggest that space may be truly mathematically infinite. If space is infinite, then the distribution of matter cannot be infinitely unique. Eventually, configurations of matter must repeat.
Meaning there is another Earth out there.
Mathematics suggests that in an infinite space, there are infinite occurrences of our galaxy, our solar system, and even exact copies of ourselves, playing out every single possible variation of existence.
The quantum multiverse.
Yes. And if the quantum multiverse is real, it implies that potential is never left unrealized. Every time a quantum choice is made, reality branches out into different histories, which leads to a staggering philosophical conclusion. If every possible timeline exists simultaneously, consciousness merely shifts between them. Subjectively, from the first-person perspective, we may never truly experience our own permanent death. We simply branch into a reality or a frequency where our consciousness continues.
Okay, but if time and space are just mental software constructs, and the multiverse is branching infinitely, what happens to me? What happens to my ego, my identity, my memories of being a host? When that construct collapses at the moment of true death, do I just evaporate into quantum foam?
NDE reports give us a very clear clue about what happens to the self. People who transition deeply into out-of-body experiences frequently report developing spherical 360-degree vision.
Right, they aren't looking out of two forward-facing eyes anymore.
No, they perceive everything around them above, below, behind simultaneously. And as they move deeper into the light, they describe the overwhelming feeling of being everywhere and nowhere at the same time. The rigid biological boundary of the self dissolves. But it doesn't dissolve into nothingness. It dissolves into a state of universal unity. You don't lose yourself. You realize that yourself was always the entire universe pretending to be a localized person.
Which is an incredibly heavy, massive concept to try to grasp while you're driving a car or folding laundry or doing the dishes right now.
Yeah.
But here is the genuinely exciting news. We don't necessarily have to go into cardiac arrest in an emergency room to experience this architecture. There are back doors to this cosmic mainframe. There are ways to hack the receiver. And that brings us to the exploration of holotropic states and the cosmic game.
This is where we look at the groundbreaking, decades-long work of psychiatrist Stanislav Grof and his wife, Christina Grof. They spent over half a century studying non-ordinary states of consciousness, and in doing so, Grof coined a crucial, defining term for this field: holotropic.
Holotropic. Let's define that root word for the listener because it explains the entire philosophy.
It is a neologism derived from two Greek words. Holos means whole, and trepin means moving toward. So holotropic literally translates to moving toward wholeness.
Like a sunflower turning toward the sun.
Exactly. That biological phenomenon is called heliotropism. Grof argues that just as a plant naturally seeks the light, the human psyche has a natural, innate gravitational drive to move toward cosmic wholeness, if we only provide it the proper environment to do so.
And Grof discovered that you don't need a flat line to trigger this movement. You can achieve these holotropic states, these glimpses of the cosmic map, through various methods while you are perfectly alive and physically healthy.
Yes, these states are not new. They have been accessed for millennia by indigenous cultures. They are achieved through shamanic trances, the ingestion of sacred plant medicines like ayahuasca or peyote, extreme fasting, sleep deprivation, or rhythmic repetitive drumming.
But Grof brought this into the modern clinical setting.
He did. In his early psychiatric career, he accessed these states legally through psychedelic therapy, using clinical doses of substances like LSD and psilocybin. Later, when the political climate changed and those substances were globally restricted, he and Christina developed holotropic breathwork. This is a purely physiological technique utilizing accelerated hyperventilation-style breathing, evocative tribal music, and specific bodywork to induce these exact same profound, transcendent states entirely naturally.
I love the story in the source material about Grof's own early personal initiation into these states. It completely changed the trajectory of his life. He was a young materialist psychiatrist working in Prague, conducting a clinical experiment with LSD, but he decided to combine the pharmacological effects of the psychedelic with exposure to a stroboscopic light.
A flashing strobe light, highly tuned, used to entrain brainwaves.
Right. So he's lying there, the strobe is flashing at its specific frequency, the LSD is peaking, and the result is a total shattering collapse of his entire materialist conceptual framework. He suddenly has this overwhelming cellular realization that time and space are completely arbitrary constructs of the psyche. They aren't real. And because he's a curious scientist, he decides to test this newfound realization. He thinks to himself, okay, if space isn't real, I'm going to fly through space to my parents' apartment across town.
He attempts to astral project.
Exactly. And he feels himself moving at incredible warp speed. He's flying, but then he stops. He realizes he isn't actually going anywhere because the very concept of traveling through space implies distance, and distance is a limitation. He experienced a pure mystical collapse of linear reality where everywhere is here and every time is now.
The source material includes a wonderful, almost humorous anecdote illustrating how profoundly this realization shifted his everyday perspective for the rest of his life. Years later, he was sitting at a restaurant, having a casual lunch, eating clams and drinking a cappuccino. The people at the table started discussing popular doomsday, end-of-the-world apocalypse scenarios.
As one does over clams.
And Grof just casually looks up from his meal and remarks that the archetypal reality of the apocalypse never made any sense to him until he had a specific MDMA session. During that session, he realized that the material universe is essentially a virtual reality created by absolute consciousness. So an apocalypse isn't the destruction of matter, it's simply the consciousness waking up and turning off the simulation.
Just casually dropping the ultimate truth of the universe over a cappuccino. But his realization aligns absolutely perfectly with ancient Eastern philosophy. I want to talk about the concept of Tathvam Asi.
Tathvam Asi is a foundational Sanskrit phrase found in the Hindu Upanishads, which are some of the oldest philosophical texts in the world. It translates roughly to "thou art that" or "you are that."
Break that down. What is the Tao and what is the that?
It represents the ultimate mystical revelation. It asserts that the individual soul, the localized spark of consciousness inside you known as the Atman, is not separate from the supreme, universal, infinite creative principle that birthed the universe known as the Brahman.
They aren't just related. They are identical,
Fundamentally identical. The drop of water is the ocean.
which maps onto Ysef Shakur's drawing with terrifying accuracy. The strands connecting the little stick-husk humans to the giant Oversoul. We aren't just tethered to the Oversoul like a dog on a leash. We are the Oversoul, experiencing the illusion of being a human.
And this philosophical realization leads directly to Groff's concept of the universe as a cosmic game, or what Hindu philosophy terms Leela.
Explain the mechanics of the cosmic game. Why does the universe do this?
Imagine for a moment that you are the universe. You are a singular, infinite, all-knowing, universal mind. You exist in a state of absolute, unblemished perfection. But total perfection is, by definition, entirely static.
Right, there's no conflict.
There is no surprise, there is no narrative, there is no growth, and there is no discovery. Because you already know everything. So what does an infinite mind do to avoid eternal boredom? The absolute consciousness fragmentizes itself. It intentionally shatters itself into billions of localized, finite, fragile beings as us, and it gives each of those fragments localized amnesia.
It makes us forget who we really are.
Yes, it does this to experience the drama of life, to learn, to suffer, to feel the heat of the sun, to fall in love, to grieve, and to grow. The dense material universe is a vast, complex, immersive virtual reality created by the divine, specifically to experience its own infinite potential from a finite perspective.
Okay, so to put it in a very simple playground analogy, the universe is basically playing an infinite cosmic game of hide and seek with itself. It intentionally shatters into 8 billion human beings, giving every single one of us amnesia, just to have the incredible unfolding thrill of eventually remembering that it's actually one giant, beautifully connected thing.
That is a very accurate, joyful summary of the cosmic game. We are not humans seeking the universe. We are the universe experiencing itself subjectively.
Okay. We have traveled a massive conceptual distance today. We've gone from hospital flatlines to quantum black holes to holographic memories to psychedelic strobe lights and cosmic games of hide and seek. We need to bring all of this metaphysical and scientific data back down to earth. What does this actually mean for you, the listener? If you're listening to this right now in your car or sitting at your desk, looking at a spreadsheet or walking your dog, how does this change your Tuesday?
The most grounding, practical evidence we have of this architecture's impact comes from studying the documented psychological after effects of the people who actually survive NDEs. They don't just come back with a cool story to tell at dinner parties. They exhibit persistent, statistically verifiable personality shifts that last for the rest of their lives.
What kind of shifts are we talking about? Do they quit their jobs and move to ashrams?
Sometimes, yes. But universally, the most profound shift is a complete and total loss of the fear of death. Because they have visibly experienced the continuation of consciousness beyond the body, the deep existential anxiety of biological annihilation simply vanishes.
That alone would change how you make every decision in your life.
It does. Furthermore, they show a drastically lessened interest in material gain, wealth accumulation, or social status. Those earthly markers of success suddenly seem incredibly trivial and hollow. Instead, they exhibit heightened self-esteem, a newfound sense of profound intrinsic purpose, and a massive, overwhelming increase in compassion and altruism.
Why the sudden altruism?
Because they have seen the architecture, they have experienced the life review, and the architecture of the universe dictates what researchers call a global ethic of love.
Let's synthesize everything we've discussed today around that ethic. If the universe is a school designed for the evolution of the soul, and if Laszlo's Akashic field, the cosmic dig library, permanently records every single action and its emotional ripple effect via the mechanism of the life review, then empathy is no longer just a nice humanistic moral philosophy. Empathy isn't just a polite suggestion from a religious text.
No. Under this model, empathy becomes a fundamental law of physics. It is as real and as unbreakable as gravity or thermodynamics.
Yes. In quantum mechanics, we know that the act of observation collapses the wave function. The observer literally dictates reality. Humanity acts as the quantum observer in this cosmic game, converting raw, infinite potential into actualized 3D experiences. Therefore, how we treat each other, what we say to each other, literally writes the software of the cosmos.
It forces a state of radical accountability. It completely dissolves the illusion of separation. When you truly understand the life review, you realize that hurting another person is literally and functionally hurting a part of yourself. You will feel their pain eventually, and helping another person is helping yourself.
That is the ultimate takeaway. So I want to ask you, the listener, a direct, practical question. Think about your life right now. If you knew for an absolute scientifically verified fact that you would one day sit in the light and experience every single interaction of your life from the exact emotional perspective of the people you impacted, how would you change the way you talk to your family tonight? How would you treat your coworkers tomorrow? How would you respond to a stranger on the internet today?
It changes everything. It elevates every mundane interaction into an act of cosmic significance.
It really does. Okay, let's briefly recap this incredible journey we've been on. We started with Ysef Shakur's viral drawing, a simple, elegant sketch of human beings connected by delicate strands to a glowing spiral and an all-encompassing oversoul. We followed those strands through the clinical sterile realities of the hospital near-death experience, exploring how the brain shuts down but the mind becomes impossibly hyperlucid. We ventured into the empathic 3D life review stored in the holographic Akashic field. We pushed past the limits of the materialist brain, realizing it might just be a fragile biological radio receiver for a cosmic broadcast. And we ended up in the cosmic game of hide and seek, realizing that we are not just human beings having temporary spiritual experiences, we are the universe experiencing itself.
It represents a total paradigm shift. It moves us from a cold, dead, mechanical universe governed by random chance to a living, conscious, purposeful, and deeply interconnected cosmos.
Before we wrap up, there is one final, incredibly provocative thought from the source material that I want to leave you with. It builds on everything we've discussed today, but it takes it in a wildly different sci-fi direction. It's called the transcension hypothesis.
This is a fascinating theoretical solution to the Fermi paradox. The Fermi paradox asks a simple question. Given the vastness of the universe and the billions of habitable planets, why haven't we found any evidence of advanced alien civilizations? Where is everybody?
Right. We always assume that a highly advanced alien race would behave like human empires. We assume they would build giant metal spaceships and physically colonize the stars, expanding outward and consuming resources. But what if the reason we haven't found advanced alien intelligence isn't because they blew themselves up in nuclear wars or went extinct? What if an advanced intelligence naturally, inevitably figures out the exact architecture we've been discussing today?
What if, instead of expanding outward into the cold, dense, resource-scarce 3D physical universe, they figure out how to leave the physical universe entirely?
Yes, what if they migrate inward? What if they transition their entire civilization's consciousness permanently into the infinite, blissful, holographic frequencies of the cosmic mainframe?
It suggests that the ultimate evolutionary destiny of intelligent life is not the conquest of outer space, but the absolute mastery of inner space.
They didn't die out. They just tuned into a higher frequency and left the physical radio behind. It's an incredible thing to mull over the next time you look up at the empty night sky. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into today's research. Stay intensely curious. Keep questioning the absolute nature of your reality. And remember Ysef Shakur's map, because whether your cultural software renders it as a dark tunnel, a vast river, or a shimmering ocean of light, the strands are real. Everything is connected.